All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm going to turn it over to Claire Beck, our Community Development Manager, who's going to introduce our guest this afternoon from the Minnesota State Historical Preservation Office. So, Clara,
yes,
thank you.
And thank you, council members who are able to be with us, and also members of Downtown Riverfront Council, Greater Fergus Falls, and other interested parties who want to learn about downtown or the National Register program in particular. We invited, the Heritage Preservation Commission invited some members from the State Historic Preservation Office to come up and talk to us a little bit about the National Register program. Back in May, our city planner at the time had approached council about applying for a grant through SHPO to have a study of our downtown done to see if it was reasonable to go down the route of asking to apply to the national program for a downtown historic district. At the time, council was a little unsure if you wanted us to go down that route or not. You wanted a little bit more information on the program. So today is the day that you get to ask any questions that you have to learn about that and get just kind of a baseline understanding before we maybe pick that conversation back up again and go down that road. So without further ado, Ginny Way is with us, and she is the National Register architect. I'm going to let you. Architectural historian from SHPO. So thank you.
Thanks, Clara. Thanks, y'all. I appreciate being invited here to talk about this program, and I ask you to bear with me. This is the first time I've done this in 3 years, thanks to COVID. So if I'm talking too fast, slow me down, and if I'm talking too slow, speed me up. We will have time for questions at a few points during the conversation, and then certainly lots of time after. I've prepared about a 18 to 25 minutes, depending on how nervous I get, presentation that will give us the underlying information, and then we can just have a conversation. So I'm here to talk about the National Register of Historic Places. That's the first thing on our agenda. We're then going to go over the NRHP listing process, the incentives and the benefits related to National Register listing, and then frequently asked questions. As Clara said, my name is Ginny Way. I'm from the SHPO office. I've been managing this program for about 7 years, and I think this is my first opportunity to have the pleasure to address y'all here in Fergus Falls. Okay, so the National Register of Historic Places was established in 1966 by the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 as amended. You may remember that in the mid-20th century, we were, as a country, talking a lot about cultural and historical spaces, as well as those related to ecology. So you get the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, you get clean water, you get clean air, you get the environmental acts of that era. So all of this to say that the National Historic Preservation Act, and from it, the National Register of Historic Places, was created to be a federal tool to bring the public to the table during federal intervention, right? So this is a federal listing. It's a property, it's a project that happens at the federal level that's administered by the state historic preservation offices. So the National Register, as you can read here, is the official list of districts, sites, buildings, structures, and objects significant in American history, architecture, archaeology, engineering, and culture that contribute to the understanding of the historical and cultural foundations of the nation. There are 5 different types of properties that can be listed: a commercial historic district, a structure, a site, a building, or an object. We see those represented here by Albert Lee, Commercial Historic District, the Pipestone Water Tower, Grand Mound in Coochin County, the Arthur and Edith Lee House in Minneapolis, and Paul Bunyan and Babe the Big Blue Ox in Bemidji. So don't worry, you're not supposed to read these. The National Register nominations today, as they come through our office, range in size from 60 to 150 pages. They are what I lovingly refer to as an undergraduate thesis on a particular property. They consist of 3 sections. One is a detailed and technical description. Here we have an example from the Montgomery Commercial Historic District. If you can see the big bold headings, those are each buildings within the district. Imagine each building getting that kind of space for the Fergus Falls Historic District. So you're talking about ownership understanding, you're talking about changes in over time and construction history, as well as a current building description for each building within the boundaries. There is also a narrative statement of significance. This is section 8. That is a long context about The property, and as we're talking today, the Downtown Commercial Historic District in Fergus Falls. Again, this is the bulk of the nomination. It ranges anywhere from 40 to 70 pages, depending on what kind of context we're talking about, and provides substantial amounts of information about the area, as well as the district in particular. It then has fun technical pieces like a boundary and maps and photos and lots of other federal form type things that nobody likes but me. So in order to determine whether or not a historic property is eligible for listing in the National Register, we have to consider three essential things. One is the historic significance, one is the period of significance, and one is the property's historic integrity. We have four significant criteria of significance. They are cleverly labeled A, B, C, and D. A has to do with the history of a property, its significant contribution to broad patterns of history. Criterion B is its association with a person. Criterion C is architecture and engineering, generally those things that we can see from the exterior. Criterion D is the yielding information or likely to yield information. There are people in our office that can talk about archaeology, which is usually what we're talking about with Criterion D. I am not them. So if you would like to talk about archaeology, I'm going to defer. In the case of a Fergus Falls Historic District, we would likely be talking about Criterion A, because the property is likely associated with the broad patterns of history in the area of commerce. Okay, so we understand it to be a commercial historic district, commercial endeavors in the region, and in Fergus Falls specific are significant to the growth of this town, and therefore the property would likely be significant as the representation of that commercial growth throughout history. Periods of significance and integrity. So a period of significance is the length of time when a property is associated with the significance that we've established. So for the sake of conversation, we're going to talk about the Fergus Falls Downtown Commercial Historic District as being significant for its commerce. This means that the time in which the property is likely significant, the downtown significant, begins when this becomes a a regional place for commerce, right? When the battle of all the tiny cities has finally been won and Fergus Falls has established itself and it's now the commercial center. Through the time when the downtown commercial district is no longer the unequivocal place to shop in and around Fergus Falls. That could be we tend to see that in two ways, either at the end of the beginning of the Great Depression, when all sort of commerce falls off across the country, and then we're not seeing a lot of investment back in downtown in the post-war area, or when the mall comes in. That's another place, right? So at what point in the history of Fergus Falls do we end up getting a viable contender for commerce other than downtown? That's going to be the period of significance. So when you think about your downtown and you think about the history of this town that you all know far better than I do at this point, think about what those rough decades might be. So when we talk about the integrity of a property, we talk about these 7 aspects, which basically is to say, does it look like and feel like and work like it did during the period of significance? So for instance, if your downtown was a boom town, we know it's not, but if it was, and it really was like hopping from 1890 to 1920, and then after that, everybody shopped somewhere else, if we're standing there, do we still feel like we're in an area that looks and feels and acts like it was still 1920? Right? The same would be true if your period of significance ends in 1940 or 1980. The thing to remember about a period of significance is with a historic district, changes within the boundary, within the buildings that are within the district, changes that have been made over time, we are going to look at them based on whether or not they happened in the period of significance and whether or not they were intentional design changes. So if you have new construction, if you have a lot of rehabilitation, if you have new storefronts put in, when were they put in, right? So in a district, the sum is more than its parts. So a district can have what we consider, let me back up one step. So once we know why a property is significant, and once we have the period of significance, we can begin to define the boundary. You think that this would be a very easy prospect, but often it isn't. So when taking a look around your downtown earlier this afternoon, the conversation becomes, would we stretch a potential district over Union Street, right? Do we go out and we grab those 3 buildings that we know are historic? Well, that look to be historic because they're older one-story buildings. Well, the street's fairly wide. We don't know when the bank at the opposite corner, whether that's going to be in or out of the period of significance, whether it's going to be in or out of the boundary. So a boundary will encompass those buildings that were contributed to the significance of the property, meaning they were used for commerce, and were built within the period of significance, which is why you end up with something that doesn't just like a square. It looks a little bit like a T or an H because you get buildings down the side streets and things like that. Within the property, within a district, you also get what are considered contributing buildings and non-contributing buildings. So if you're walking up and down your main street, Lincoln, and you're thinking about it, you're like, oh, well, that building was built in 1980. That's after the period of significance. It's non-contributing. Or that building was built in 1901, but was significantly remodeled in 2002. Despite the fact of its construction date, it now looks like a 2002 building. That's non-contributing. In general, a district needs more contributing buildings than non-contributing. It can also matter how large non-contributing buildings are and where they are, but all of that is very minutia and is not really pertinent for the topic of this conversation. Okay. Anybody have any questions about the 30,000 foot overview of the National Register of Historic Places? No? All right. We're all sitting on the stool.
All right, I've got a question.
I love it. Yes.
So if, just out of curiosity, I'm assuming there's many sites, building structures, districts that fit into more than one category?
There are.
And just out of curiosity, is there a once overarching criteria that you judge them on, or do they then judged independently in each of those, or how does the final determination made?
Within a district?
Just with,
Or just in general?
with a specific site, maybe it was, maybe it could fit into maybe the architecture, but also the point of interest or the grounds.
Yeah.
Or,
Absolutely. I can check more than one box, and you can too. So each area of significance can have its own period of significance. So if you have a building that was architecturally, it was built in 1902, and it's an incredible Italianate building, for instance, and we're going to list it for its architecture, that period of significance is the time in which the building got the features for which it's significant, and therefore the period of significance is 1902. Say in 1915, there were rousing debates about women getting the right to vote, and we have an incredible history of suffrage that happens in that building. So we have a period of significance from 1915 to 1921. So now we have 2 criteria and 2 period of significance, and it can be historic for both. Or they can overlap, or you can have multiple. For instance, I noticed in your downtown, there's a clock, right? So there's an object within your district of buildings. So we'll have a conversation if you choose to move forward with survey, an intensive survey of this district. We'll have a conversation about whether or not that clock contributes to the property and whether or not it would be considered an element. Okay. So the listing process takes about 2 years. You lucky people get to work with me the whole time, so congratulations. So a preparer, whether that person is a paid consultant or a volunteer within the city or something, I really highly recommend you use grants to pay for a consultant. Let me just put that out there. It's just a really, really big job. But whomever it is, their role and responsibility is to document, research, and analyze, and ultimately write the nomination documentation. They are going to work with me through review and comments and guidance. So we will go back and forth. It's an iterative process. Think about drafts. Think about your best argumentative essay in your favorite high school English class. That's how it's going to go back and forth. We are then regulatorily responsible for the notification process. This is when we would notify all of the owners within the district what is happening. We would send them a list of frequently asked questions. We would give them the right to object. We will talk about that in a minute, don't worry. Once the state feels that the property is documented adequately, which is the word in the regulation, we send it to the State Review Board. The State Review Board is made up of 15 professionals whose careers and interests have made them good candidates to analyze these documents. They are going to also review and comment. Ultimately, at our State Review Board, which meets quarterly, they will make a recommendation for listing. If they choose to recommend the property, then the SHPO does further work and we process the documentation and send it off to the National Park Service, who once again reviews and comments on the document and then ultimately makes the final decision. As I said, these documents can be 150 pages long. They're incredibly technical, and it takes approximately 2 years to go through this process, depending on whether or not you choose to use grants. The State Historic Preservation Office and the National Park Service all have regulatorily determined periods to respond. So most of that time is actually taken up, understandably, first by your preparer who is doing all of that work, and then second by the regulated required notification times, which allows more than 70 but no more than 120 days for all owners to be notified. It also is during that time, that notification time, that if you choose to do this and we move to listing, I understand we're 2 steps ahead now. And I also understand that you really just care about the incentives and the benefits. But if we do that, we will come back. I will come back. I will speak to your Chamber of Commerce. I will answer questions from your owners. I am here to help and support the nomination in however the council sees fit. Incentives. We're all familiar with this building. They are individually listed in the National Register. They have taken advantage of the State Historic Preservation Tax Credit Program. So the biggest carrot listing in the National Register has is the Historic Preservation Tax Credits. There's a federal tax credit that's 20% of your qualified rehabilitation expenses. I don't pretend to know a whole lot about that program and how it works in its minutia, but I can certainly help you answer by answering any basic questions if we want. There are some brief points up here. We also have, in the state of Minnesota, we're lucky to have the Minnesota Historical and Cultural Heritage Grants. These grants are available to education properties that are owned by educational institutions, nonprofits, and government-owned profits. So I noticed that your children's museum is downtown, right? So if they are a 501c3, they might be able to take advantage of grants. In order to get planning and construction grants, being listed in the National Register is the first step. So that's how the National Register and these incentives work. If you want state or federal funding, you have to be listed in the National Register, and then you follow specific guidelines about those projects as outlined by the specific programs. In addition to the money, there are all of these benefits for being listed in the National Register. These are things that we have seen. So it increases heritage tourism, and there are statistics about how much money and how much time a heritage tourist spends in a town versus a regular tourist. It supports local business. We have numbers that say it bolsters economic development. It provides opportunity for diversity and inclusion. Promotes environmental sustainability, creates educational opportunities. So we have to understand that beyond the listing process, this document would provide a significant amount of information about the commerce in Fergus Falls. That information is not proprietary. That information can be used by your local economics department. It can be used by your Chamber of Commerce. It can be used by the Ottertail Historical Society. It can be used by anybody for promotion and honorific plaques, if you want, whatever you want to do with it. I would challenge you to think about all of the publications related to tourism. And if you look at the covers on the front, they very, very rarely have a building built after 2000, right? The places people are promoting are the places that make them special, which are inevitably their historic spaces. Now, whether it's big H historic and we list it in the National Register is great, and you can take advantage of these tax incentives and you can use it for promotion. However, if you just understand that it's old and unique and interesting, we can still get a lot of these benefits. Not that I'm not telling you to list. I'd love it if you listed, if we get there. Okay. FAQs, these are all on our website. I can answer 1,000 of these. These are the ones we tend to hear most often. Are there restrictions? It comes to money. If it is privately funded and privately owned, you're a building owner and you wish to change your storefront, the National Register does not place any restrictions on you. We are not the preservation police. We have fewer teeth than your local HPC. If a property is listed in the National Register today, the owner can tear it down tomorrow. There is, later we'll talk about that, but most people in a commercial historic district are worried that if the property is listed in the National Register and they want to change their windows, they want to put in new HVAC, they want to do something on their roof, that they're going to have to send it to our office for review. And the answer is no, unless you're using federal, state, or local funding, permitting, or licensing. If you're using the state historic preservation tax credits and the state has skin in the game, you got to play by the state's rules. The same is true for grants. However, if it's your money and it's your property, it's none of my business.
Just to clarify, you just, because I just come up, did you say permitting and licensing?
Mm-hmm.
So if someone needs a license to change this, for the sake of argument, if someone, which they do, need a license to change the sign on the front of their building downtown, is that what that
Who gives the license?
city of Fergus Falls?
Or a building permit, you mean?
Yeah, some
nope.
sort of license or permit.
State licensing.
Okay, I see. So the answer is if it's local licensing.
It doesn't apply for local licensing.
Yeah, we do have in our city ordinances, since we have a local heritage preservation commission, technically if it is a locally registered building, if a permit is applied for, it should be going through the HPC for some kind of a comment. We don't see that happen a lot. I think maybe we just don't see a lot of really big work happening on our historic buildings, but that's one place where preservation conversations could happen, would be the local HPC.
But local designation and National Register listing are two different processes.
I'm just thinking through questions that I'm sure that local business owners
course.
would have.
Yep.
So when
Yeah.
I heard funding, completely makes sense. Licensing, that's permitting. That's another. That's a level like that doesn't seem quite as.
So for instance, let's talk about, is it the River Inn? Okay, River Inn is amazing. It's right on on the water. I assume the Corps of Engineers has some sort of jurisdiction over that waterway. They may not, but if they do, and the River Inn wanted to expand and got into their space, and the Corps of Engineers had to give them a license, then the project would be reviewable by our office under federal law.
Sure.
If you wanted to give them a permit to repoint and they were locally listed, then the HPC would take a look at it. If they're only National Register listed and all they wanted to do was repoint and change their signage, then it would have nothing to do with us.
Thank you.
Sure. So that goes to can I make changes? Again, it comes to who the owner is, where the funding comes from, and what's your level of designation. Public, private money, private owner, National Register listed, we have no say. We have no review authority over your project. Can I demolish my property if it's listed, right? If there's a fire and we're looking to demolish the property, if someone is just no longer interested, they want to build a new property in your main street, they can demolish it. There's a little law there. The responsible governmental unit, so you as who would issue the demolition permit, could choose to go through the Environmental Quality Board environmental assessment worksheet process. That is not something that SHPO is a part of. That the Environmental Quality Board determined that along with water and air and various other things, National Register listed properties were considered part of the common good, and to demolish a listed property in whole or in part would require a process. The process allows public comment. The process does not stop the demolition. Is additional maintenance required once a property is listed? No. Again, I have no authority to force a property owner to maintain their property in any way. Environmental review in section 106. So these are terms you may or may not have heard of. If you're familiar with the federal process, I won't read all that because it's, even for me, it's super boring. But basically, if the federal government, the federal or state government are doing, or federal government is doing a project in or around your historic property, they need to take into account the effects of their project on your property. So if MnDOT is working on, or the county is working on with FHWA funding, if they're working on your repaving Union Street and they want to widen it or they want to put in extra curb and gutter and they want to do things like that, they're going to consult with our office about how to mitigate the adverse effects to your property. So this is why I started with the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. It's a federal to federal conversation, and historic properties get in the middle. We do have a website there, the SHPO website, registration, National Register of FAQs. And that's actually the end because I was under the impression that we might want to chat more than y'all might want to listen to me ramble. So how can I help you better understand this program?
Yeah, Scott.
Simple question on how you draw the boundaries. Everything that I've seen, the boundary is always contiguous. And what happens if you've got something that's outside of that, maybe by a block or two, but it's still really significant and you'd really love to include it? Is there a way to do that, or you just have this island out there, or is it just doesn't happen?
The National Park Service is hesitant to create a discontiguous district. So if the island of a historic properties is separated from the mainland, for lack of a better term, by too much, then it likely will remain outside of the boundaries and unlisted. And if it has sufficient significance, we would look at individual listing. Under some circumstances, we can cross a large expanse of parking lot or a couple of uncontributing buildings to pick one up. It really depends on what we're trying to reach, how far it is, and how substantial that property is. You don't want to snag 6 non-contributing buildings to get your one, because then your district looks contrived.
Well,
So-
it might be contrived, but, if that's what you're trying to do, then that's what you would call it, I guess. The specific example I was thinking of here in town would be the railroad depot that's been made into a restaurant.
I
That
believe
one- It's pretty significant as far as historical, but it is a little bit of the distance between it and downtown.
It's on.
And if I
it's on.
recall,
It's
already
It's
listed.
national
it's
register.
individually listed. I think I have it on here.
Yes.
There it is.
Individually
Northern Pacific.
listed can be its own thing then, and it doesn't matter what this boundary is.
Exactly. So every property is a little bit a little bit different. I named the 5. We're talking here about a commercial historic district. A commercial historic district is buildings related to commerce that aren't necessarily individually eligible. They are greater than the sum of their parts. It gives us a sense of place as we look at a street wall instead of the depot, which is able to convey historic significance in and of itself.
Which leads me to my question. So I assume that districts, the majority of the time, are sponsored. Not that I don't know what the right term is. Sponsored by a public entity like a city or a local unit of government. But the buildings individually are they? They don't have to. They can be. That's privately listed, correct? Or are privately nominated for registration. Is that accurate, or is it through the historic? Is it through the Otter Tail County Historic Society?
Any entity can sponsor a nomination. So the national, and well, I'm going to use that to dovetail into a point I failed to talk about. Thank you for that. The National Register of Historic Places will not list a property over owner objection. So regardless of who is paying for the nomination, it is imperative that the owner support the nomination in order for the nomination to be successful. So In this case, I'm not sure, I presume, because I don't know if the Northern Pacific Depot used national tax credits. Mike, do you happen to know? No. Okay, so I'm getting a little bit of a mixed signal over there.
They didn't, but I think they approached the city or
Okay.
through Chris also about getting the property listed.
About getting the property listed. So,
If you were interested.
Mike, you told me 7 times, the Cadets?
Yes.
Nice. The Cadets building, they were interested in historic preservation tax credits. They undertook the cost of listing in order to receive that financial benefit. The Northern Pacific Depot, I'm not sure who sponsored their nomination, but they could have come and asked the city to partner with them on a grant in order to do that, or they could have undertaken the cost on their own.
So, sorry, I got,
No,
my
no.
clarification, so when you said a property can't be listed over objection from the owner, or over the owner's objection, does that hold true for a district as well, as far as like an individual building within a district?
It does. Let me tell you about that. That was the point I told you I would come back to and then failed to because I didn't put a slide. Owner objection. So in a historic district, you will have a series, oh, shoot, I went the wrong way. The series of owners. And we'll say the Owatonna Commercial Historic District had 100 because I'm terrible at math. So if 51 of those owners formally objected, then the property listing would not go through. An owner is allowed to object. They get 1 objection per owner. It doesn't matter how many properties they own. And they have to formally object in writing that is notarized to the Historic Preservation Office. They cannot simply tell us that they are uninterested in listing. To formally object. It's 50% plus 1. So if you have 100 properties owned by 100 different entities and 51 of them object, the nomination will not go through. 49 of them object, and the nomination will.
For
But that
all of
is-
the buildings?
49 of the owners.
I mean, for all of the buildings are.
For everything within the boundary. Contributing, non-contributing status makes no difference. But that is also why, I mean, in Waseca, I did 3 discussions where I drove down to Waseca and we had conversations with the council and the Chamber of Commerce and the Economic Development Committee. I will give this presentation tweaked to your liking as many times in front of as many people as you want. If you choose to support a nomination, I can do that. Now, before we get to choose to support a nomination, we don't actually know if you have a district. So as Clara was saying, the first step in this process is not going to be listing. The first step in this process is to have an intensive survey of downtown done. And at that point, they will determine, the consultant you hire will determine the period of significance, the boundary, the criteria of significance, and likely will do enough contributing, non-contributing status to let you know whether or not your district holds water. If it holds water, then moving on to the formal listing process is an option for you.
Are there questions from the audience?
That's where we're at, Mayor. I mean, we need to do this intensive survey to determine eligibility, correct?
Yes. Do I need to speak into this for y'all to hear me? No, I'm pretty loud. I noticed there's a question. Would you like to?
Yeah, Natalia, please.
So, do you have any case studies or have you done a comparative analysis on another community comparably sized to Fergus Falls that would indicate what the economic impact was before and after an historic designation?
I hope not, because I'm a historian. There's a business called Place Economics, which does that work nationally. Donovan Ripkema is the owner of Place Economics, and they do a lot of work. And then we have, Minnesota has an economic impact report that comes out every year that is produced for our office by the University of Minnesota. And that has information. I'm not sure if they've done a district, but they have a lot of numbers regarding the historic preservation and the amount of financial impact to a community versus new construction. So we use historic preservation as opposed to demolition and construction as a net gain. Mike, do you know any more about those financial things and
Not necessarily, but I would just sort of reiterate that the place economics that Jimmy just mentioned, if you simply type that in, it's all one word. They have an amazing website that has a surprising amount of detail about all the studies that they've done, the reports that have been produced as a result of them being hired by cities, by states. They're an internationally known firm, so their work is really solid. It's probably the best single source for getting at those answers to questions about, the economics behind preservation. But then on our website, we do have links to the state economic reports that Jimmy also referenced. So you just have to look under the tax incentives part of our webpage for the information on those annual reports that are done through the university. And they've been done now for over a decade, if I'm not mistaken.
certainly as long as I've
So
been shipping.
we have a track record of, how the numbers have played out. So for instance, the amount of return for each dollar that's spent compared to when the tax credit is used and not, that amount of money has increased, gradually over time. So for every dollar invested, I forget what the amount is, but I think it's over $10 return. Whereas 5 years ago, I think it was more like $8 and some cents or $7. So, the amounts have gone up. So the data is there. It's really helpful.
Also, and I don't know to what extent they have this information, but Rethos is the statewide nonprofit, and they run the Main Street program. So I'm not sure if they have data related to listed versus not listed, but they certainly have data related to an understanding of a historic and cultural whole, as opposed to not recognizing it and using it as their power of persuasion.
Minnesota Statute 138.73 is designation of historic districts, and it lists maybe about 20. It starts with Pipestone and ends with Victory Memorial Drive and Milwaukee Avenue Historic District. Are these locally designated historic districts that are in this statute? What are these historic districts?
Those are state-listed historic districts. That is an act of the legislature. We have not added anything to that particular list in a long time.
It looked that way when I read the list.
Yep, so listing and designation tends to come in 3 layers. Nationally, which is a bit of a misnomer because you can be significant on a local level and still listed nationally, so you don't have to be nationally significant. The state level, which in the state of Minnesota requires an act of legislature. They don't actually consult with our office at all about boundary criteria or anything else. And then local designation, which everyone in this room is familiar with because you have a Heritage Preservation Commission. While the 3 work together, they are distinctly different entities.
And if one were dealing with a state designation, just because it hasn't happened for a while, doesn't potentially mean it couldn't happen. Is that accurate?
Correct, absolutely. The law still exists.
You just have to work
And
with your
does it-
legislator.
What was that?
You would have to work with your legislator.
Right. And does that open doors to tax credits and the financial components that the national district does?
It does not. No.
So, if I remember correctly, I believe the city's worked with Rolf Anderson maybe on a similar study on the campus, the Regional Treatment Center campus. Do we have an idea of you obviously walked downtown today, and Michael's been here a number of times, the scope of, a district that size, what that might take as far as a study to determine, if it holds water, and what that might cost, and then, as important, where that money, what grants might be available to the city, or what funding options, if any, are available for the city to consider
Sure.
as they make that decision.
Let me answer the first question. So yes, I know you've worked with Rolf Anderson. He's great. Sue Granger, whom I think you might be familiar with as well, did some studies a number of years ago. The Minnesota Historical Society has a preservation specialist directory list this would have to go out for bid, I presume. Our rough guess as we walked around downtown was between $20,000 and $25,000 for the designation study, the intensive the intensive survey, and I will smile at Mike to talk about funding.
You want me to open up my wallet?
Yes, specifically.
How convenient.
You take the tough ones.
Yeah, well, the easy answer is that the city as a certified local government could apply for grants from that program, which are available once a year. They are matching grants, but we would be able to give 25,000, for instance. That's the magic number that's determined to do the work. And by matching, I mean that we have a ratio of basically 70% federal funding to 30% local. And so the city would have to come up with match for that 30%, and it does not have to be cash. It can be an in-kind contribution from city staff, from members of the Preservation Commission. You know, it's a combination typically. Some cities do have cash to bring to the table, but all that does is simply elevate the total amount of money.
Sure.
But the number that Jeannie and I arrived at was literally just after walking
Really rough.
for about an hour downtown and kind of ballparking it in our heads. There's no, I guess technically there is a formula that we can rely upon, but it's really more of an intuitive sense of that's probably what it would cost.
And when are those, you said once a year, when are those?
The draft
grants awarded?
applications are generally due around the middle of January every year. So the timing is actually good because there's a little bit of time to think about this, you know, determine how it could happen, come up with a request for, you know, not an RFP, but an actual draft application, you know, things of that sort. Because that's all done by the city and the HPC. I mean, I can help them, but I can't write the grant application for you. So that would have to come from the city.
And I would also like to point out, if you were to choose to engage a consultant through the CLG program to do an intensive survey of your downtown, and they said you have a wonderful district and we're really excited about it, and you never chose to list it, that's a choice you can make. So you're not obligated to list just because you identify a district. I would encourage you to, but I want to be very clear.
Here's another question, and in your experience, when does the public, the local ownership discussion take place? Is that part of the is that pre-grant application to do the study? Is that during the study? Is that once you've established whether or not you have a project you think can move forward? Is it all of the above? I'm just thinking about our Chamber of Commerce. I'm thinking about our downtown businesses. And when, as we think through this HPC, when's the proper time to, you know,
So
multiple times I'm assuming, but
yes, as often as you feel like is necessary, but I don't caution over communication. I think transparency is incredibly important. However, as the consultant is doing their study, the business owners need to be aware that it's happening because there's going to be somebody coming around taking pictures and being on the street probably for multiple days. But until a boundary is sort of established, it's hard to tell which buildings are going to be in and out. So we don't want to come and have a conversation. Well, we'd be happy to, but you don't necessarily want to come have a conversation with 300 owners when only 100 owners are really going to be potentially affected. I have done, I don't know when Mike has come and had public talks about his grant program. I'm not sure during the grant process when that happens.
It's varied, and I've had conversations about that here, but it's always kind of been wrapped up with conversations about other preservation in general.
Okay.
But I would agree with you that I think having any kind of a public forum, in my opinion, would be better to wait until after that survey phase is completed, till we get a better handle on what's the universe of buildings that we're looking at, what is the potential boundary, as Jenny just said, you know, possible ideas about a period of significance, things of that sort. Because I think if you try to provide that information too early in the process, it either could get confused or misunderstood or something along those lines.
Feelings get hurt when things are in or out when they didn't know that they would be. That. I will say it is best practice to have that conversation during the notification process before we send out notification letters. So when the draft nomination is largely complete, I would come out and talk to people so the first time they hear about this officially from our office is not a letter in the mail. However, I also highly encourage a discussion once a contractor is if you get through your intensive survey and you choose to move on to National Register listing, once that contractor is under contract, I would suggest that we come together and answer questions related to the documentation. Frankly, well, depending on the contractor, sometimes they can answer tax credit questions that are beyond my ability because they work in the tax credit programs as well. With regard to, can I change my balustrades and how do I do my windows?
But to reiterate your point, if the city did choose to apply for a grant and we're funded to go through this study of this historic nature of our downtown, what we do with that, we may want to do something locally, we may want to approach the state legislature, we may want to look at national registration. It would really be up to us, depending on what we find and how we see that it might benefit our local businesses, our community, right? There's no obligation.
There's no obligation.
We need to do that intensive survey in order to move on to those steps, whatever you want to do.
And if we were come to talk to your Chamber of Commerce or whomever about the intensive survey, we would not be talking about National Register nomination.
Right.
We would leave this talk for later, and we would talk about what a survey is and what the findings might be and what the repercussions of that are, which is basically we get to put everything in our system, and we get very excited that we know more about your town.
Any other questions from council or anybody? Yes, Patrick.
Let's just say hypothetically, there's a Victorian era commercial building downtown that would be considered a contributing building had the facade not been so severely altered in the 1980s. They get a new owner. The new owner is inspired by this whole process and wants to replicate the historic facade on the building. They get some grants to do it. They do a spectacular job. It looks just like the old photos. I'm under the impression, even under those circumstances, it cannot qualify as a contributing building because no matter how good a job the owner does at replicating the original facade, it's not the original facade, right? Am I correct on that?
Just hypothetically.
Technically, yes. So if you were going to be, if you wanted to be considered contributing as a replication, you would need to meet the Secretary of Interior standards for replication. Those are very, very high. They come with a whole lot of requirements with historic plans and photos and all sorts of stuff. However, if you wanted to get pretty dang close and you wanted to use the Secretary of Interior standards of rehabilitation, then, and you successfully go through a rehabilitation, you can. It's just whether or not you tell people, whether or not the office understands that we intended to be exactly what we were in 1896, or we intended to look like something that was appropriate in 1896, and now we contribute. Did I see that you had your hand or were you touching?
So I would suggest that the HPC discusses the issue. I'm sure you have discussed the issue, and then we set up a time sometime in the next couple of months where the HPC can come to a committee of the whole with some sort of discussion point recommendation, and the council can decide if they want to continue. Is that a logical next step?
Yeah, we should come to you for with a recommendation.
I would think that that would make sense.
And Clara has both Mike and I's contact information, but it's up here just in case. If you have any additional questions in the meantime, please feel free to reach out. I also have included the Historic Preservation Tax Credit Incentive Program contact and the Environmental Review Program contact if you have any questions about the regulatory aspects or the tax credit aspects specifically at this point.
Thank you, Jenny.
You're more than welcome.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for being here. HPC, thanks for your work on this. Thanks, everyone. We'll be back.